Welcome to Washington Talk. I'm Young-Gyo Kim. During his speech at the UN Human Rights Council, U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken reaffirmed Washington's commitment to put human rights at the center of the U.S. foreign policy, and encouraged the Council to support resolutions addressing human rights violations in North Korea. As Blinken made the first diplomatic moves at the world stage, a U.S. court ordered North Korea to pay more than $2.3 billion in damages. Today we'll discuss these and more. Joining me is Olivia Enos, Senior Policy Analyst at the Asian Studies Center at the Heritage Foundation. Ms. Enos focuses on national security challenges and human rights issues in Asia. Scott Snyder also joins me today. He's the director of the program on the U.S.-Korea policy at the Council on Foreign Relations. He's authored numerous books on the Korean Peninsula, with the latest being South Korea at the Crossroads. Welcome to the program.
Thank you.
First of all, Ms. Enos, we'll start off with Secretary of State Antony Blinken pledging the U.S. will champion human rights around the world. Was he signaling a new direction the U.S. is headed?
Well, it was really great to see Secretary of State Blinken reiterating and reaffirming U.S. commitment to promoting values around the globe. And I think that this has been a historical part of U.S. policy in Asia to promote rights. But depending on the moment in time, it's received more or less attention. I think it was encouraging to hear him saying that human rights issues will be a priority, especially considering that some of the world's worst human rights violations are emanating from the region, whether that's genocide taking place in Xinjiang or the severe human rights violations carried out by the Burmese military against the Muslim minority Rohingya. And of course, North Korea, where we see the Kim regime consistently perpetrating human rights violations, including in those political prison camps that hold, between 80,000 and 120,000 individuals and are likely growing.
Mm-hmm.
Well, I think what was really striking about Secretary Blinken's speech was first a return to the status quo ante of the U.S. taking leadership on these issues, but also the strong linkage of democracy and human rights in contrast to authoritarianism. And so I think that this is definitely going to be an active part of the Biden administration's foreign policy. It also means that we're likely to see more contention on human rights related issues as part of policy toward North Korea.
Mr. Snyder, we understand the need to be upfront with North Korea on the human rights issues, especially when we see little change in the situation the North Korea people are in. Is there a way for the U.S. to really address this?
Well, it's absolutely correct that North Korea controls the situation on the ground, and that Kim Jong-un probably views the issue of human rights as an existential threat to the structure of the regime. And so the best that the U.S. can do in the absence of levers to induce internal change that are likely to be decisive is to shine a spotlight on these issues. And I think that the right way of doing that is really to focus on the fact that North Korea is not meeting international standards of human rights because it helps to depoliticize and to undermine the argument that North Korea continues to make that the human rights issue is a function of U.S. political views of North Korea and a U.S. hostile policy toward North Korea.
Ms. Enos, what is a practical, realistic way for the U.S. to approach the North Korean human rights issues?
Well, I think that for too long, U.S. policy has pursued two separate tracks, one that focuses on the nuclear issues and the security concerns, and one that focuses on human rights issues. And the decision to bifurcate the response actually does a disadvantage to both policies because arguably, as Scott just alluded to, the Kim regime views both its nuclear weapons program and its missile programs, as well as its human rights violations, as a means of maintaining its own grip on power. And so if the U.S. seeks to make progress, it should be bold in raising both issues.
Mm-hmm. The previous Trump administration was widely seen as refraining from raising the issues of human rights with North Korea. hoping not to derail denuclearization talks. Ms. Enos, so do you expect the Biden team will be different?
I hope that the Biden team will be different. I was on the ground in both Singapore and Hanoi during the summits, and it was very alarming to see the summitry proceeding with little to no mention of the human rights violations, particularly when the Trump administration had been so outspoken after the return of Otto Warmbier and at various moments during their negotiations. So I hope that the Biden team will reinvigorate calls for integrating human rights into talks with North Korea. And I think even based off of, if we believe that people are policy, there have been some very fantastic people who have been appointed, including Jung Pak, who in her own book, Becoming Kim Jong-un, talks about how the nuclear and the human rights issues are two sides of the same coin, and how there's a real need to address both of those challenges to make progress when it comes to denuclearization or any other policy priorities with North Korea.
Mm-hmm. Mr. Snyder, if and when the denuclearization talks begin, will the Biden administration be able to bring up the human rights issues?
Well, I actually think that the human rights issue has always been a component of the interaction. It's just that the denuclearization issue has drawn the lion's share of attention. I recall that President Trump did ask about Otto Warmbier, for instance, at the Hanoi summit. But it is absolutely correct that both human rights and denuclearization are illustrations of the depth of the divide between the U.S. and North Korea, and evidence of the difficulties that are going to be involved in trying to close that gap. And given the depth of the divide, I think that all we can do, if indeed talks resume, is to look for avenues by which to chip away at that gap. And I do think that it's important for that gap to be made smaller, both on the denuclearization front and on the human rights front.
And after the U.S. called the UN Human Rights Council to pass the resolution on North Korea's human rights violations, the South Korean government said it has not decided its stance on the resolution. And instead, South Korea stressed concerns over the human rights situation should not hinder the international community from paying attention to the humanitarian situation in North Korea. Mr. Snyder, what do they mean by this?
Well, what I'm concerned about with regards to the South Korean position is that it presents human rights versus humanitarian considerations as an either or, when our correct approach should be that it's a both and, that we both address human rights concerns in North Korea, and we address the possibility of humanitarian distress in North Korea. And so, hiding behind the idea that we need to address the humanitarian issue is not really an appropriate response to the issue of whether or not we need to address the human rights issue in North Korea.
Do you sense there could be some conflicting views between Washington and Seoul over the North Korean human rights issues, Ms. Enos?
I am worried that Seoul and Washington are on different pages right now and reading off of separate sheets of music. One of the particular areas of concern was the introduction of a so-called anti-leaflet law by the South Korean government that forbade South Korean NGOs from being able to disseminate information into North Korea. And I think that the restrictions, it's called an anti-leaflet law, but the restrictions are actually quite a bit more broad in terms of their reach. And we've also seen the South Korean government, for example, denying a very well-known NGO, the Database Center for North Korean Human Rights, access to the Hanwon facilities that many defectors go to in the early days after they have come from North Korea. And these are the types of activities that we're seeing going on in Seoul And I think that this is very concerning because Seoul is often looked to, and South Korea in general, as a bastion of liberty and freedom inside of Asia. And we don't see the Moon administration necessarily taking up the helm and promoting human rights inside of North Korea. And I think that the Biden administration, you're seeing this right out of the gate with Secretary Blinken's comments and with comments even on the campaign trail by Biden himself, that human rights issues, that the promotion and preservation of democracy will be a core component of their strategy. So I think there's a real need for leadership from the Biden administration to get the alliance better on track so that we can have the two countries really working in tandem with one another instead of going in opposite directions.
The U.S. State Department has always made it clear that it continues to campaign for the free flow of information into North Korea, as it helps improve the human rights situation. But South Korea's ban on anti-Pyongyang leaflets are taking effect in March. Do you think this will be a big concern for Washington, Mr. Snyder?
Well, it's definitely distracting. I mean, we already see that the South Korean government is having to go back and revise this legislation because it was very ambiguous and perhaps overstepped the bounds of what would be reasonable in terms of proposed legislation. That's an important step that needs to be taken. But also the U.S. and South Korea, I think, needs to enter into a more active conversation beyond leaflets on other issues like radio transmissions or other uses of technology to try to ensure that there is freedom of information, into North Korea. It's very complicated when the Moon administration actually attempts to implement measures that are publicly suggested by Kim Jong-un's sister.
What about you, Ms. Enos? The U.S. Congress is planning a hearing on this, and some North Korean defectors even visited the State Department and had talks regarding anti-Pyongyang leaflets. Why do you think this could be such an important issue for the U.S.?
Well, I think that, as we talked about before, the US does view the promotion of values, of universal values, as critical to its policies. And when you see an alliance partner who has historically been very strong in the promotion of values, both within its own country and also beyond its borders, basically capitulating, as Scott said, to the whim and the will of Kim Yo-jong, Kim Jong-un's sister, I think it sends a really concerning message about the direction that civil liberties and political freedoms are going in South Korea. And so I think it's really great to see Congress, which has historically played a really critical role in the promotion of human rights, shedding light on these issues and also giving defectors the space to be able to express their own dissent, especially when the South Korean government is not necessarily allowing them to freely do so. So I think it's critical, and I think it speaks to really the diverse nature of U.S. government, that you have so many people, civil society, Congress, the executive branch, expressing in different ways concerns over this new law.
Critics of this new South Korean law says this new law can be interpreted in so many different ways that it could put a limit on the freedom of expression, especially among the North Korean defectors. Do you think this concern is valid?
Yeah, that's the reason why the South Korean government has decided to revise the law. It was needed to address the ambiguity related to the scope of the offenses that were covered in the law, and also the seeming disproportionateness of the punishments. The law is written basically makes illegal any propaganda expression of opposition to the North Korean government in whatever form and from whatever place. And so that actually means that the law could be applied to efforts to send messaging into North Korea from China or from other places adjacent to North Korea. That's very broad, and it's actually not possible to enforce. And so that has to be addressed. But really, I think that the bigger issue, maybe the more significant issue, is that the government of the Republic of Korea already has the ability to manage its border areas through administrative means. And it really doesn't need this kind of law in order to address the particular set of activities that have become a point of contention.
Mm-hmm. And Ms. Enos?
Yeah, I mean, I think that to some extent, the introduction of the anti-leaflet law does reveal kind of the nascent and albeit a little bit fragile nature of South Korean democracy. I think we often forget that South Korea is actually a newer democracy, and there are many ways, even historically, that I think many South Koreans don't enjoy all of the freedoms that we in America enjoy. And I think that this anti-leaflet law, while it's great to see that they are planning to revise it and make changes to it, the fact that it was just sort of, unilaterally carried through working against the will of the South Korean people and the South Korean NGOs that are simply seeking to bring freedom to a place where there is none, is quite problematic indeed.
Mm. Meanwhile, in the U.S., a courthouse has ordered North Korea to pay damages to the crew of the spy ship USS Pueblo for being tortured and mistreated for 11 months in 1968 after being captured by North Korea. This follows a similar ruling in 2018 when a federal court held the North Korean regime liable for the death of Otto Warmbier. Ms. Enos, do you think the recent ruling will encourage the others who suffered under the North Korean regime to seek justice?
I think that it's entirely possible that they may see progress on other fronts and think about ways that they could seek justice from the North Korean regime. Although sadly, I think that a lot of the efforts, especially in the ICJ or otherwise, may not be successful in giving them the aid and the assistance and anything that they may seek. That being said, I think that there's always a need, and I was actually very encouraged by the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights report that was arguing for greater efforts to collect evidence and information in the event that we have some sort of transitional justice and accountability measures that are invigorated by governments around the world or by individuals themselves. And I think that there's always a need to be consistently collecting that evidence and making use of those North Korean refugees who are brave enough to speak out and talk about the injustices that they faced at the hands of the Kim regime.
Mm. Mr. Snyder, what do you think are the implications of the latest court decision? Do you think this could serve as a pressure towards North Korea?
Well, what it shows me is that the dimensions of the confrontation and the breadth of issues between the U.S. and North Korea are broadening as the U.S. essentially uses lawfare and personal liability in some ways as a weapon in response to North Korea's prior efforts to do the same. I mean, we have to recall that in recent years, individuals who had been detained in North Korea and then were subsequently released had to pay huge hotel bills. And so, this in some ways is a response to that. Of course, the Pueblo goes way back, but the scope and the duration of the pain and suffering on an individual level that occurred at that time was severe. And we also have to keep in mind that the Pueblo remains in the center of Pyongyang as a tourist attraction. And so the North Koreans are continuing to reap propaganda value on an issue that actually they could have removed from the agenda long ago simply by returning the ship.
The Biden administration maintains that human rights are central to its foreign diplomacy, signaling a change in the U.S. policy from the previous Trump administration, which was often hesitant to hold an open discussion on North Korea's human rights issues on the international stage. And with Seoul's stance not being finalized over the UN resolution, it has yet to be seen how Washington and Seoul will coordinate on North Korean issues. Ms. Enos and Mr. Snyder, thank you so much for being with us today.
Thank you for having us.
And that does it for this week's Washington Talk from Voice of America. Please join us again next week for more analysis.